Now, the topic of my soapbox talk, as you've heard, is somewhat convoluted and is, perhaps a clumsy attempt to link a talk with my book, but overlaps with the themes of my new book, and it's called The Exotic Rissole, and it's essentially a personal memoir. And it is a funny title. Already a lot of people have kind of thought, is it the erotic Rissoles? I'm going, no, there's no sealed section in this book. And nor is it a cookbook. I was launching it last night at readings, and I had one lady very enthusiastically come to the talk, and she said, I love coming for food books, and I really wanted to see what this was like. I thought, oh, God. Now, as I said, the book is a memoir, but I think in sort of researching it, and it's funny researching memories, if you like, it did sort of make me engage a lot with how, say, so-called exotic groups, be it Asians or Arabs or Africans, essentially non-Westerners, how they might, say, look and perceive Westerners, I'll say whites or Australians, whatever you want to call it, the mainstream, if you like. And it partly comes from, I guess, one of the themes of the book is that idea of looking in from a non-traditional culture, and both kind of in a longing sort of way, and for me being kind of surrounded by, say, chili, turmeric, and all these, and religion, a host of, and sort of long traditions. I do remember as a child just being, quite excited by just going to a household with, say, a soda stream machine or cooked baked potatoes and rissoles with kind of this naked food with kind of no spices. And I write that it was sort of my version of porn as a youngster. Now, the exotic is often sort of defined in opposition to the mundane. Now, part of the appeal of the exotic is the promise that it will remove the subject from the everyday repetition and dullness of life. Now, the exotic discourse is one of desire, and for me, that desire is encapsulated by the Rissole. Now, someone derived from Asia, I think I've often grown up sort of hearing how exotic, alluring, or sometimes detestable my ancestry was, from reference to spices, tanned complexion, or mysticism. But the curiosity, there's more to the word exotic, isn't there? The curiosity often concealed a prejudice that non-Western cultures like my own were sort of childlike and uncivilized, belonging to sort of backward traditions that were in need of enlightenment. And obviously that, there's long, sort of strong, sort of colonial overtones. And I think I observed in fascination, say, households of my friends, the spice-free, relative transparency of their discussions, and often kind of an absence of any religious dimension. And from a very early age, I kind of got a sense from, say, elders in our sort of tight-knit ethnic community, how they sort of practiced their brand of kind of self-satisfied superiority. And in some ways, it was a defence mechanism, that assuring me that sort of, many white people, they didn't really care about what the elders construed as, say, the bedrocks of community and social stability, essentially family, clan and tradition. I was also often told that white Australians were always drunk, which I found, a unique prejudice, and unfortunately I've probably taken on some of those traits sometimes, particularly through university life, but I think I've passed on from that stage. Now, one of the themes I wanted to touch on today, I think, as the axis of power sort of slowly turns towards the Orient, I think the very notion of what we may call exotic is beginning to change. Now, only in the last week, and I think it's in the news today, the government's announced that they'll hold an inquiry into the importance of Asia and how important, say, Australia, the importance of the rise of Asia to Australia. And while, in some respects it's a statement of the bleeding obvious, but I think from learning Asian languages to supplying it with diplomats, which we do very poorly, in fact, never has what, say, Asians think of Westerners been more important. And while the ravages of, say, colonialism and Western perception of the East shaped so much of the modern developing world, I think recent history in the century ahead is more likely to be shaped by Asian cultures, say, peering in and perhaps even imposing their views and prejudices of the Westerners. Now, this is where I stumbled on the idea of Occidentalism, essentially how this refers to, say, negative perceptions that usually non-Westerners have consistently had about the idea of the West. And, some of you may have been at university and did arts degrees, would have heard the term Orientalism, and it was these things you sort of hear about in arts lectures or hear words like postmodern. And I did a medical degree while I was doing arts. And I remember sort of going back to my medical student friends and being dismissed with my kind of, funny new terminology. And often it's funny how these words, we pick up these words at university, then we sort of get real jobs and mortgages and we forget them. But I found it funny that I'm thinking about some of these words again. And obviously that word is made famous by the late Palestinian philosopher Edward Said. And it's an idea that's been a major contributor to recent conflicts, including, say, for example, terrorism, and I'll touch on that. And these prejudices illuminate a lot of modern trends that are sort of inconsistent with the libertarian idea that the inevitability of human freedoms and political liberty. And you often hear that, say, in reference to China, that it's kind of destined to fail, this authoritarian structure. And even some of the difficulties, say, with the Arab Spring too, I think some of these ideas, which I'll refer to, I think, still lie beneath. Even now, something I found out, the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor were actually preceded by a group of philosophers, and they met in Kyoto to discuss Japan's role in the world and find ways to overcome modern civilization. That's what the word they used, essentially a descriptive term for the West. Now, the ideological basis for their attempted domination of Asia was to liberate and cleanse Asian minds of Western ideas. Now, these ideas, in no particular order, referred to, say, materialism, liberalism, capitalism, individualism, rationalism, and moral laxity. And the key characteristics of what they identified as the Asian spirit were deemed to be self-sacrifice, discipline, austerity, individual submission to the collective good, worship of divine leadership, and a deep faith in the superiority of instinct over reason. Now, these concerns of the Japanese philosophers before Pearl Harbor, you could just as well interchange them today with some of the anxieties with, say, Al-Qaeda. Now, similar language is actually used by German National Socialists and European fascists. And the West, they loathed, they had a view of it, the term they'd often use was soulless, and they saw it as this sort of multinational, multicultural place. And their symbols of hate then were essentially, say, Republican France, capitalist America, liberal England, and in Germany particularly, the idea of the rootless cosmopolitan Jews. The West they despised was a reaction against a particular concept of citizenship and community, where citizenship, according to them, had kind of degenerated into a purely political concept. Something the intellectual godfather of Nazism, who's a historian called Houston Chamberlain, said in the early 20th century. His West, much like, say, the Norwegian mass murderer Anders Breivik, was based on blood and soil. So, just to summarise, the four features of Occidentalism that are often referred to, you could sort of strip it down into four categories. Often categorised as the city, the bourgeois, reason and feminism, in terms of the four things often criticised. The city represents everything about urban civilization, sort of commerce, mixed population, artistic freedom, sexual license, scientific pursuits, leisure and wealth. A lot of the figures, say, throughout the 20th century, Mao, Pol Pot, Hitler, and even sort of the Japanese sort of agrarian fascists and even Islamists, all extolled, say, the simple life of the pious peasant, kind of pure at heart, uncorrupted by city pleasures, used to hard work, tied to the soil and obedient to authority. And behind this ideal of rural simplicity lies the urge to control large masses of people. But also a sort of religious rage that goes back as far as, say, the ancient kind of superpower Babylon depicted in the Bible. So it has very sort of strong religious roots, and I think there's themes of it in many religious texts, particularly the Abrahamic faiths. Next, the very idea of reason being separate from God has also been part of this soulless theme. Something Mao once said, there is nothing special about making nuclear reactors. You need to have spirit to feel superior to everyone, as if there is no one beside you. So in this sort of discourse, if you like, science, like everything else, must be infused with a higher ideal. Knowledge wasn't enough. And that higher ideal, it stems from Volk, for the Germans, or say God or Allah in modern terms. So their human reason essentially seen just as fallible as man. The third one, the bourgeois, what did that mean? Essentially seen to these groups as a kind of anti-hero. They're often depicted as, say, counting money, seeking personal safety, lacking heroic convictions. So Mao's ideal of permanent revolution was a blueprint for continually stirring things up, kind of for a society invigorated by constant heroic violence. The same themes follow through to, say, kamikaze pilots or modern jihadis. I think bourgeois life, the middle-class existence is seen in this context as, especially the middle-class urban existence, is seen as kind of inherently mediocre. And lastly, this real antipathy towards feminism and the lure of female sexuality. Again, in the Occidental discourse, the proper role of women is to be the breeders of heroic men. Interesting, Japan during wartime was arguably one of the most sort of male-dominated societies throughout the 20th century. And interestingly, the wartime actually emancipated women to quite an extent, because suddenly they were in factories, they were running lots of things, they were in employment, they had to administer a whole range of things. And interestingly, it actually transformed Japanese society significantly. Now, to all those who see military discipline, self-sacrifice, austerity, and worship of the leader as the highest social ideals, the power of female sexuality is seen as a dire threat. Now, this is something I've certainly observed, say, growing up in a, say, traditional ethnic community. When elders spoke of their contempt or fear of apparent moral corruption, really what sort of lay underneath was really about sex and women, how the possibility of sexual freedoms for women threatened the whole social order in their eyes. It's sort of a promise of a kind of a sinful, libidinous world of sort of infinite pleasure, which is usually beyond most people's reach. So these are the four trends of Occidentalism. Now, all of these would be very troubling if it weren't sort of balanced by a parallel admiration for many things Western. Now, very recently, a survey last year from Forbes magazine found that modern-day Indians are more enamoured by America than any other country in the world. And they really see it as a kind of lodestar of modernity, the very epitome of modernity. And, I think that's something throughout the world, and we saw that recently with Steve Jobs' death as well. And the Indians would very much see being a trait sort of coveting the consumerist middle-class lifestyle, while at the same time fearing the untrammelled social freedoms and the perceived potential for depravity and decadence. Likewise, the Chinese now have a whole field called success studies and heap admiration on the two Carnegies, the early Andrew and the later Dale, both of whom preached a message that success is born of hard work and application, and by extension, that those who fall by the wayside are responsible for their own circumstances. Now, whilst certainly the hard work application overlaps with sort of many Confucian ideals, certainly the whole concept of luck in this sort of modern idea of success is somewhat diminished. Now, the rise of the West and the subordination of the rest of the world lies at the heart of modern history. But, many people are fearing now, with the financial crisis and a range of things, that we're sort of living through the twilight of Western predominance. And in part, it's because the rest of the world, particularly, say, China or India, are applying some of the best aspects of Western civilization, such as markets and the scientific method. And as they rise, the very idea of the term exotic will also change. Now, I found a very interesting reading, say, a description of sort of Chinese tourists recently, how there's a whole host of, say, Chinese travelling through Europe, and they have their own very specific tours and go to very specific places that have significance for them. And their tour guides tell them sort of not to consume the local food, that they may get sick from it. And also that they kind of, they would kind of look on these medieval architecture, kind of pondering, the greatness of this civilization from 100 years back, while sort of lamenting its modern decline, which is very much, say, how it feels almost colonial. And likewise, in the midst of, say, the financial difficulties, China was sort of held up as a possible saviour to bail out European economies, which is highly unlikely. But now, just to finish, we essentially brought front row tickets to the Asian century and play a prominent role backstage. What happens in the minds of Asians, their conflicts and passions as they hurtle towards becoming the dominant mass of the world's middle class and the crucial engine of global prosperity, matters. And it's important to us because it will spill over into our suburbs and our boardrooms. And if we play our cards right, they may even find us exotic and desirable. Thank you.